Welcome, everyone, to the Extraordinary Games Podcast. I am your host, Dave Winchester, and my co-host this week is my good friend Harrison, I pretty much would give the title of co-founder of the podcast since he is the one that gave me the idea to do it. And this week we're going to be talking about the original Dead Space, since the remake is right around the corner. But before we get into it, let me remind you all to follow us on your podcast app of choice. We're on Apple iTunes, we are on Amazon, we are on Spotify, we're also on YouTube at Extraordinary Games, so you can subscribe there, hit notifications. You'll actually get a video version of the podcast, pretty much with just gameplay footage of the games we're talking about and things like that. But if you want a little bit of supplemental stuff, you can go there. And lastly, we do have a Patreon. You do not have to throw any money our way at all. This podcast will always be free. You just get a couple extra perks here and there, and I'm going to be kind of doing a little bit more with that in the coming weeks. But for right now, I'm mostly concentrated on trying to get these podcasts out every week in a timely manner, so that way you have something to listen to on your way to work every Monday morning. Before we get into it, I'm also going to tell you what I've been doing recently. So I recently started playing a few Switch games that I want to talk about. Well, technically Switch and PC. So the first one that I'm playing is Loop Hero, which I know came out last year, and I completely just forgot it existed. And it went on sale on the Switch and Nintendo eShop, and I picked it up, and I've been enjoying the hell out of it. It's super addictive. I'm really hoping one of my friends plays it so that way I can talk about it on the podcast, because it does a lot of unique things that I really, really enjoy. But yeah, I've been playing a boatload of Loop Hero recently. And on my PlayStation 5, I've been playing Tormented Souls, which is kind of a Resident Evil Silent Hill throwback game that came out, I want to say last year. It might have been the year before, I'm not sure. But it's wonderful. It has those fixed camera angles, a lot of survival horror themes into it. Just a really interesting indie title that I hope we get more of, because those types of games, those classic Resident Evil style games with the fixed camera angles, are something I really, really enjoy. And after that, I'm probably going to finally jump into God of War Ragnarok if I can pick it up soon, because I still haven't purchased it, but I love the original God of War from 2018. I call it the original. It's really like a continuation. The naming scheme for that game is kind of wacky, but I really look forward to playing that. For podcasts coming up later this week, I think I'm finally going to be able to record the Mega Man X podcast, and there's going to be a surprise one. And I think after that, I'm going to start the Phantasy Star Online podcast. I might do a solo one for myself, talking about my experiences, and then pretty much kind of like interview all of the guests that I've had on so far, and maybe some other guests as well, surprise guests, about their experiences with Phantasy Star Online, because I personally think it's one of the greatest games ever made, and a lot of people have some very fond memories of playing that game, and I hope you enjoy listening to those stories as much as we're going to enjoy telling them. But that's it. That's all I have to say for now. I'm going to put on some music, and when we come back, it's going to be me and my boy Harrison talking Dead Space. Enjoy. All right, so this week we have my good friend Harrison on the podcast. We're going to be talking Dead Space, which honestly, like, this whole podcast, first of all, came about with us just bullshitting at work. So, and this was one of the games that we were talking about from the beginning. It was like this, BioShock, and a handful of other games. So I'm kind of stoked that we can finally talk about it today.
I am very excited. Hello. I may sound tired, but it's just in general tired. No, but Dead Space is one of those weird games where I played the second one first. I don't even know why I played it. I have a deep passion for horror in all genres, but for some reason, I was like, yeah, Dead Space 2, that's the one I'm going to get on board with. And I never finished 3.
Dead Space had like more hype, didn't it? Didn't it have like, because Dead Space 1 was like kind of like the underground darling, when Dead Space 2 came out, they had like the weird ads where it was like, this game will scare your mom.
That's what I remember from it. That was the only ad I saw for it, was like the one that got a lot of publicity, where it's like all the moms being like, this game is disgusting. I would never let my kids play it. They're playing this. I'd rather them play Grand Thefting Autos. And I saw that and I'm like, oh, this game looks badass. And that was like right around the time where like Gears of War is taking off, where it's like ultra bro-ish violence. And it's like, all right, sweet. Yeah, Xbox.
Yeah.
Things like that.
I mean, that's pretty much how it was. You had like a good 5 years where everything was either a bro shooter or it was the bro shooter area. You had Call of Duty, you had Gears of War, you had a bunch of military games. I'm pretty sure fucking Medal of Honor was rebooted as like a bro military game. So that just like dominated the entire space. And eventually, I mean, Dead Space 3 ended up kind of being that anyways. Like the whole game tweaked over to that type of playstyle with the co-op stuff in Dead Space 3.
And it's funny because you would think that was like a massive shift, but if you look at all of them in a vacuum, like you look at Dead Space 1, it's a pretty like cut and dry like type of game, you know. It's a horror game. It's a very well done one. And that's why it doesn't seem like anything super generic. Because it's not, but also it's not really doing anything too new. But then you look at Dead Space 2 and it's like, all right, in comparison to 1, it's more action-y, but it still does the horror. Then you see 3 and it's almost entirely like cover-based shooter. I'm pretty sure there is cover-based shooting in it too.
There is. And there's human enemies, which was the weirdest part to me. Like everything else was fine. The human enemies was weird. Human enemies was like, what the hell am I playing right now?
I don't remember if I finished playing that. I don't think I finished 3. I think I got close, but also that game is so forgettable. But all I remember is 2 sections. I remember the start of it is you're running around a city shooting guys, and it feels like it feels like trying to make a more subdued Deus Ex, like as far as gameplay goes.
It was definitely weird. Like, I picked up Dead Space 3 like on launch because I had a friend that I wanted to play co-op with. And then he saw the reviews for the game. Now keep in mind, I bought the game. I already had it. Like, I was like, I fucking downloaded like all the shit was downloaded into my console because I always installed games to my console for the faster loading times. And then like I text him like, you ready to go? And he's like, oh dude, I didn't pick up that game. Did you see the reviews for it? They were kind of garbage. And I was like, you motherfucker. Then I was forced to play through the game solo after that. And it's not a fun solo experience. And it had that shit where you'd have to like, you pretty much had like a little droid or something that had to go collect ammo for you. Yeah. And if you were really shitty at the game, you could just buy, like, it was microtransactions to buy ammo, which was so fucking stupid.
And that was the upsetting part, was because like I didn't play Dead Space 3 on release. I didn't have friends that would play it at the time, so I'm like, I'm not going to bother. But later on in life, an ex of mine and I played through a lot of it, and I feel like, you know, that was the first time I played it was co-op. I feel like doing it without is just, you're missing out on so much of the game. And that was when, that was that like the start of EA like feathering in like, oh, maybe microtransactions is the future. And it's like, you know, they're going to do it anyway. So it's like, like you're using a critical darling of a game series to promote this new push. It's terrible, terrible.
Well, that's EA. I mean, I can tell they had like no faith in this franchise from the start. Like if you look at Dead Space 1, the game had very little marketing behind it. It had that one really, really good trailer, and then they put the game out and probably figured it wasn't going to make remotely as much money as it did. And then when it did, they were like, fuck, we got to make sure like as many people play this game as possible. And then they just ran the studio into the ground.
And that's the upsetting thing, because you look at Dead Space 1, it's very clear from the outset, a lot of people who cared about making a good game worked on this game. And you can see the influences, you can see like the effort put in. that game was pushing the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 to its absolute limits. And it's mind blowing. I'm very grateful it succeeded because it got some good games out of it.
Oh yeah.
But it's upsetting because you look at it from a financial standpoint, you're like, there's no way this game would make enough money by their standards today.
I mean, yeah, by their standards today, yeah. I mean, there's a reason why they're putting out like Battlefield, even when it's unfinished, just to, you know, cash in on shit before the holidays. They're a 100% money making machine now, but back in the day they weren't. And you know what? I just found this out today. So this studio, Visceral Games, used to be Redwood Studios. Did you know that this studio, before they did Dead Space, made like the best of the Lord of the Ring games from back in the PS2 and Xbox era? Like the Two Towers game and the Return of the King game?
I only know that because I watched an interview with Glenn Schofield, the director of Dead Space, and he mentioned it in passing. I would not have known that. And it is mind blowing because those games are great. I just bought, which one? I think I bought the Two Towers for PlayStation 2 the other day, like more recently, just because I want to have it.
Yeah, I rented that game when I was in I worked at Game Crazy. Like that, those games came out, and I didn't want to buy them because they were just like hack and slashes, and I knew that. But like I rented them, and the difference between like the first game in that series and then what they did with like Two Towers and Return of the King is insane. Those games are so good as action games. Like, so those games should get a remaster. Like just remaster two of them, put them in a package, put them out.
Absolutely.
So fucking great. But the studio is phenomenal. And the fact that it is no longer around really pisses me off because this studio had more potential to put out more great games and make great series. And instead, after this, they were pretty much shoved on Battlefield Hardline. And I think after that, they were just shuttered because Battlefield Hardline didn't sell enough. It's kind of fucked up.
It's incredibly frustrating because I love horror games, but it seems like they seldom do well unless they're attached to an existing IP. Like, you are hard pressed to make a Resident Evil game that flops at this point. You know, Resident Evil 6 was, in my opinion, very, very underwhelming. And I feel like that could have been the end of it. But then Capcom just came out with a whole bunch of Resident Evil games that everybody loved. And now it's just kind of like, there's no way to stop it. But if you, like, at the time of recording, they're planning to put out a Dead Space 1 remaster. And I feel like that should be a good sign, but also it could just mean nothing.
Yeah. I mean, they're probably just banking on the fact that, you know, the first Dead Space it wasn't the most successful sales-wise, but it definitely has the kind of like the best following. Like the people that like Dead Space, they think the first game is the best. I personally think the second game is kind of tied with it. But it would be weird to remaster the second game before remastering the first game. So I think this is kind of going to be like the start of them going back, remaking Dead Space 1, probably remaking Dead Space 2. And then if I had like money to put down on what they're going to do next, they would probably just either pretend Dead Space 3 didn't happen and just like kind of start the franchise over or use a new story, or just do the two remasters, get as much money as they can out of them, and then just like completely forget about Dead Space for another like 10 to 15 years. Either one, like that's going to make them money.
I'm curious because I try to go into games as blind as I can. Same thing with movies, but with games, I don't want to know too much. Like, I only just saw some gameplay for the Dead Space remaster, and it looks like all the beats are there, but then I saw one scene and I'm like, all right, they're changing this because, you know, they have the ability to. It's like shot differently, and gameplay wise, fundamentally, it's going to be the same thing, but it's also like, all right, maybe they're trying to push it like 2 inches to the left, and then you keep pushing 2 inches to the left, you're already like an entire mile away from where you started if you do it enough. So I have a feeling, I'm assuming at this point, Dead Space 1 remaster is just going to be, you know, a success, because why not? I'm going to buy it. But I have a feeling it's going to get pushed so far in a different direction by the time it gets to Dead Space 2 they might just have an entirely different game series at that point.
You could be right. Like, it'd be easy for them to do, especially considering that Dead Space 1 is, I want to say, 15 years. That sounds wrong, but I know it's right. I think it's 15 years old this year.
Yeah, 2008, I believe.
Yeah, so most of the people playing Dead Space, the Dead Space remake, remaster, I don't even know what the hell they're calling it. We'll say Dead Space fucking 2023. Most of those people have never played the original. So I would assume. I mean, there's going to be people like you and me who are still going to buy it because we remember the original game. But I think they're doing an excellent job of promoting that game to a newer audience, especially now that Callisto Protocol is out and it did not do very well as far as reviews go. That leaves a huge gap where they can just put this game out and be like, well, Callisto Protocol was supposed to be this, but like we actually got this. Like this is what you want. And I feel like that's going to make it sell like gangbusters.
And that's the funny thing is, like, it seems like a good time for horror games. We had an era of, what was it called? Amnesia, where it was kind of walking simulator, but also like a little horror themed. Those never did much for me because I like the idea of I have choices. I can run, I can try and get away, or I can fight. If the only option is to run, well, that's not too much fun. It's like playing Outlast. I never felt truly scared in that. But playing something like Dead Space, knowing I have options, and that means every encounter can go a multitude of ways, it's going to be a lot better. And we're kind of getting back to that now. Around the same time, Dead Space remaster's coming out, getting a Resident Evil 4 remaster, and it's mind-boggling because those are two of my favorite games, and it's a wonderful experience to be able to have that come back around, the wheel turning that way.
Yeah. I actually think this is definitely the time of a kind of I don't want to call it a survival horror resurgence, because a lot of the games coming out aren't technically survival horror. They're more just horror as a whole. But look at games like Inscription, which you're the one that like recommended it to me, and it's got such like an undertone of just like horror elements. That game's actually really popular as far as an indie title goes. But you're talking about games like the Dark Anthology series. Those have become popular over the past few years, and even though they're kind of like playing a movie versus a game, that still has a good horror element to it. I feel like right now just horror games in general are starting to get a lot more, I guess, eyes on them. And I really hope that means people start experimenting more with the horror formula as a whole, because I think there's a lot of untapped potential. I feel like once horror games started to hit their stride is kind of when Resident Evil 4 came out, and then it just like instantly shifted over into action. It was like once they figured out like how to like do survival horror really well, it kind of slid straight into the action formula. And then we got games like Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space and games along those lines for a little bit, and then it went straight into walking simulator. And I feel like we kind of like missed kind of where a renaissance would be for survival horror games, and hopefully that's coming around now, because we have a lot more like indie developers that are willing to experiment and do things. Like I've been playing Signalis, and that game's got so many survival horror elements and horror elements into it. And even though it's not like a huge big budget title, it definitely like hits that sweet spot of this is an interesting concept for a horror game, and they're executing it really well. And the studio probably will put something out that will top that next time, because Signalis is such a hit, and I look forward to things like that. And I hope that just continues, like that cycle just keeps going.
And that's a good way to put it, because it feels like during the interim of Resident Evil 4 and then into walking simulators, in that it feels like they kind of overcorrected where horror games are starting to get more action-based, because Resident Evil 4 pushed it a little bit like, all right, it's a little faster paced to make it more inclusive for other people, but it's a good balance. And then, Resident Evil 5 comes out, it's more action-y. Resident Evil 6, at that point, it's not even horror. it's not even survival horror. It's just like, play the game. So it feels like they had to overcorrect and overcompensate in that, where it's like, all right, now it's just all spooky. And it's like, well, you took agency away from me, so now it's kind of in this weird spot where, yeah, it's scary to be walking around here, but that's all I'm doing. I'm not actively engaged. I'm just going through this area now. So I feel like we're getting back to a good spot in that, and it's taken a few different games like a while, but you're absolutely right about indie games are just pushing for things that will actually, be conducive to good gameplay as well as engagement.
Yeah. The reason survival horror as like a whole, like if anybody ever asks me what my like favorite genre of video games is, survival horror is the one. And the reason why is it does everything that I like. It gives me action, so it gives me those like action moments that I enjoy. But it also has puzzle solving. Like a good survival horror game will have excellent puzzle solving, and that always gets me. Even Dead Space, which we'll get into in a minute. Dead Space has some really good puzzles involving telekinesis, and they blend combat in with it very well, and I really enjoy that. But like the original Resident Evil series is such a good idea of like blending these combat elements mixed in with like survival elements mixed in with puzzle elements. The only way it really falls short in those original Resident Evil games is the combat kind of sucks. Like if you're looking at Resident Evil like 1 all the way up through Code Veronica, the combat isn't fun to do. It's just something that you kind of have to do to get to the next section. And then once you got to Resident Evil 4, where the action elements were good and the combat was good, I feel like the puzzle elements and everything else kind of got like taken back a little bit, and that balance got shifted a little bit more. And I just want somebody to come up with like a modern survival horror game where the puzzle, the action, and the horror are like that perfect like 33.3% blend across the board. And I'll just be so fucking happy if that ever happens.
Oh, absolutely. And like that's what I want in my survival horror games. It's like horror movies. Like horror in general is a good coverall. There's some horror movies I've seen that are simultaneously some of the scariest things I've seen, but also the most heartbreaking like familial dramas. And it's a weird dichotomy that they have, but it works so well. And same thing goes for horror games. Like I do wish more horror games had combat, had good atmosphere, we'll say, just to encapsulate all of it. And then also good puzzles, because I don't want the only puzzle I do to be, shoot the guy. And the original Resident Evils, they have clunky combat because they're a product of their time. But also it's like, obviously that lends itself to a little bit more of the intense nature of it. However, now that we've gotten more advanced in what we can create, something like Dead Space and something like Resident Evil 4 is, I think, safe to say the base level.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. It's nice to have these games coming back around too. Having Resident Evil 4 remake and the Dead Space remake coming out in the same year is really cool. Like if this happened originally, like the first time around, I kind of probably would have been like, holy shit, this is insane. This is just like 2 excellent games at once. But having them come out now, I think it's going to be one really cool because the Resident Evil 4 remake is doing everything that Dead Space does as far as like the controls and action go, which in my opinion, Resident Evil 4's shortcoming are the controls. Like that's the thing. It's somewhere in between the insanely good controls of Resident Evil 6 where you can like dive, roll, and shoot and all that shit, and the garbage ass controls of the original Resident Evil games. Like you can't move and shoot, but the shooting is accurate enough and serviceable enough where it's still like it works. Like it does what it needs to do. But now with the Resident Evil 4 remake being able to like move and shoot and have the mobility that you kind of have in Dead Space, I think it's going to elevate that game a little bit more because one, more people are going to be able to play it because the control scheme for Resident Evil 4 is definitely dated now. 2, it allows them to kind of tweak the action scenes around that. Like, now that you can move and shoot, I'm curious to see if they either add more enemies or different enemy types to kind of compensate for it, or tweak the amount of enemies or how enemies react in a certain area. And I'm not scared that it's going to be bad, because I think they've proven themselves in Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil 2, those remakes, that they know what they're doing. Like, they know what they're changing and how to best service the game itself. It's going to be interesting when Resident Evil 4 comes out. I'm actually more excited about the Resident Evil 4 remake for that reason than I am the Dead Space remake, because the Dead Space remake just looks like a 1-for-1 with like very subtle changes, whereas Resident Evil 4 remake looks like an entirely different game. It's like looking at the Resident Evil 2 remake and the original Resident Evil 2.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And I'm sure a fair bit will be changed with the Resident Evil 4 remake, because, you know, back in the day you could, but it would require a whole different setup. But you couldn't really have your character be too actiony in your horror game. It just wasn't like the vibe at the time, we'll say. But also, it's probably not what they wanted to go with. They knew how to keep your character in place and shoot, but not move around and shoot. And it would have pushed it too far actiony, in my mind. And that was one of the things that the director of Dead Space, Glenn Schofield, cited. He cited Resident Evil 4 as a big influence on Dead Space. And that was one of the things they wanted to innovate on was, you know, he said he didn't like that you would stay still. You know, your character is going to be moving around. He's not going to stay still while he's fighting. He's going to move around and things like that. And it was that sort of innovations that pushed Dead Space to be as good as it is, in my opinion.
Yeah. So let's start actually talking about Dead Space. the reason we are here.
Yeah.
I know, right? We've talked about. I mean, we've talked a bit about Dead Space already with the remakes and stuff, but
yeah, and I mean, you kind of need to set up like where it comes from. You can't talk about Dead Space without talking about its like spiritual predecessors, like Resident Evil and similar games like that. And also, it takes influence from a multitude of horror movies too. So it's sort of a love letter to horror in general. So it's hard to not talk about things outside of it. And I think unjust.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I know you said you played Dead Space 2 before you played Dead Space 1. I played Dead Space 1 pretty much on release because I worked at a video game store at the time. And there were two reasons that I picked up Dead Space on release. Like, I didn't wait for any reviews. I didn't wait to hear what other people had to think and say about it. But the main reason I did it was, one, I saw the trailer for it, the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star trailer, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the best trailers ever released for a video game, like of all time. Like, it's bar none, hands down. That trailer encapsulated everything that they wanted Dead Space to be, which was it very hard to do at the time. But that trailer, combined with the fact that one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's sad to say because it's a Paul W.S. fucking Anderson film, and goddamn, I hate that guy, is Event Horizon. And it just instantly, I looked at it and I was like, wow, this is Resident Evil 4 meets Event Horizon. And I just have to fucking play this game. It looks so cool. And upon playing it, I got almost exactly what I expected, which is definitely rare coming from like that time where every trailer you would see was kind of like a vertical slice of a game and wasn't necessarily what you would get when you started playing. So it was actually shocking that I got exactly what I anticipated. And even the story of this game fucking knocked my socks off the first time I played it, because at the time I didn't see that twist ending, which we'll get into later. But this easily, from the first time I played it, was shot up to one of my favorite horror games of all time. And it'll scoot its way into my top 10 games of all time for sure.
It's funny you mention Event Horizon, because the director cited that as a big influence, and it's very clear, from the outset, that's a very good place to take influence from. I haven't seen all of Event Horizon. It's just not, I don't know. It seems like something I would like, but just does nothing for me. But it's strange because I only finished Dead Space sometime last year, which is shocking to me because I played Dead Space 2 on release, but never thought to go back to Dead Space 1. I didn't play Dead Space 3 until years after it came out. But then the second I played Dead Space 1, I played through it once. I'm like, all right, I'm playing it again. And I played through it 4 times in the matter of a week. At that point, I was like, all right, this is a great game. I love this. And I started playing Dead Space 2. And I'm like, they just improved everything in Dead Space 1, which is already a game that is light years ahead of its competition. And it's mind-blowing to me that it's not a bigger series.
Yeah, because they killed it. Because this series wasn't a bigger series because of Dead Space 3. That's it. That the Dead Space 3, even though it was a critical success and it sold a lot of copies, I think by that point the fans kind of saw where the series was going. And luckily EA saw the writing on the wall. And they were just like, Dead Space 3 came out and they're like, well, that's the trilogy. And I feel like EA probably thought if they pushed it any further in the action direction, they would completely kill the franchise. And there was really no place else to go with it. So they just left it. And that's probably why Visceral was moved on to doing like Battlefield series stuff. And it's really disappointing because it's one of those things that we'll never know what would have happened if Visceral Games wasn't forced into making Dead Space 3 what it was. And let's not like beat around the bush about it. That's exactly what happened. The reason multiplayer was in Dead Space 2 was because EA wanted multiplayer in Dead Space 2. And the reason Dead Space 3 had co-op and had all these microtransactions was because EA wanted Dead Space 3 to have co-op and microtransactions. These are all things that Visceral did not want and had no plans on putting in their games until they were forced to do so. And those were, like, if you look at Dead Space 2 as a single-player game, people never had any gripes about it. That game was superb. But they also were kind of disappointed that there was a multiplayer mode, and a lot of people didn't play it. And then when it came to Dead Space 3, they're like, this isn't what we want. We enjoyed the single-player experience, so we don't want co-op. We don't want co-op that's going to ruin the storyline of the game, which is what it did. And they didn't want microtransactions in it. And all those things being thrown into that game meant that players probably just didn't want to play it. And EA saw that and was just like, okay, fine. If this is what we want, but this isn't what you want to play, then fuck it. We're just going to walk away from the series.
It's frustrating because you can see, you can use these games as a benchmark of where video games as a broader spectrum were at the time. Like Dead Space 2 came out around the time where every game had to have a multiplayer component, even if it made no sense whatsoever. You look at Dead Space, you're like, all right, what could we do for a multiplayer? I guess just like a half-baked infection game mode like in Left 4 Dead, except Left 4 Dead that's based around that. So throw that in. And I feel like that reverberates throughout the entire single-player experience too, because you go around in Dead Space 1, you're in these larger open areas, as in like pseudo-open world-ish, like you have a central hub area and you have to do all these branching objectives and then you come back to that hub area. It leads you forward. In Dead Space 2, it is almost entirely a straight line with much less deviation. And I was replaying it recently thinking, oh man, this game is so long. And then I got to a spot where I was like, hang on, wait, isn't this like close to the end? I haven't finished it, but I'm almost all the way through it without even knowing. And I feel like in large part that's because of, EA diverting time away from crafting a better single player experience to have multiplayer, which, to their credit, I played it like a few weeks ago. The multiplayer is still up somehow, which blows my mind. And I can only assume that's because they charge money for an online pass, which is the dumbest concepting that should show you all you need to know about video games as a product.
Yeah, those good old online passes that were around for like 2 fucking years to deter people from buying used copies of video games, which was the scummiest shit ever, like ever.
It's so dumb. Call of Duty, I don't think ever had that, and those games are entirely multiplayer based, almost, which is funny because something like Dead Space 2, who's going to be like, dude, you got to get the online pass for Dead Space 2. Why? Why would I want that?
Yeah. It was just okay. I will say it kind of worked though, because like having worked at a game store around that time, a lot of people wouldn't buy. Let's say I think Madden had it, and that was like a huge thing. So people would be like, "Oh, can I get a used copy of Madden?" And we would have to tell them, like, "Yeah, you can, but if you're playing online with your friends, you're gonna have to buy a $10 pass anyways. You're better off just spending the extra $10 and getting the new copy of the game, because then you have a new copy of the game." And you can play online, and it's the same exact price as the used copy. So in turn, it kind of worked, but it also was such bad press for EA, which is probably why they did away with it. They were probably like, we're making money off this, but like we are just getting shit on so hard in the media. Because I remember every game that had it around that time, every review that came out, they mentioned that fucking pass. So people knew about it.
Because that was also right around the time they were trying that. You know, the Dead Space series kind of became like a little petri dish for EA to test their terrible ideas. You know, Dead Space 2, you got the ham-fisted multiplayer and then online passes they're testing. They're like, all right, let's see if we can get away with this. People love the first one. Let's see what we can get away with. And then the third one, they're like, all right, we got away with a lot in the last one. Let's just throw microtransactions and co-op in there, see if they notice. And then people noticed, and they're like, all right, well, we're going to put the series on ice. We're not going to kill it. We're not going to do anything rash because it's still making money. But, you know, EA is not shy about just shutting stuff down for no reason. So here we are.
Yeah. And the shitty part about Dead Space 3, though, is they had a completely different plot planned for that game, and the co-op ruined it. So, like, they had, like, a full-fledged storyline, and it was still going to take place on the snow planet, but it wasn't going to be that like weird, I don't want to say Fight Club, but like kind of like Fight Clubby thing that they kind of had going on. There was going to be like the main character is going to have like an evil counterpart. They had like a whole script planned out, and they had to fucking scrap the entire thing and then shoehorn co-op in, so that way it made even some sense. And it still doesn't make sense if you play in co-op. There's tons of shit that's weird with that game.
I enjoyed Dead Space 3 on its own merits, but I will not say it's a good Dead Space game. I enjoyed playing co-op because I was playing it with somebody I liked at the time, but that's it. Like, I don't regard it as a scary game. I don't think it's particularly good as a Dead Space sequel, and the story is trash. I can't remember any of it. I remember maybe 3 things from that entire game, and I can't even tell you what the plot is. All I remember is I think your partner's name is Carver.
Yep.
I'm pulling that from the deepest recesses of my brain right now. And he has hallucinations too, because everyone at this point has been infected by the marker. They gave up writing a story. They're like, all right, we need to make one more Dead Space game, then we can be done with EA. We can move on to something new. So they're just like, you know, cash the fucking check at this point. And they're checked out, like they don't want to do it anymore, which is fair. Dead Space 1 is a pretty concise game. You start it, you end it. Dead Space 2 picks up probably where it should have. Like, it seems like a pretty good conclusion. After that, though, you don't really need anything else, and that was kind of the problem. And then when EA's like, hey, make a third one, still making money, they're like, well, what do we do?
Yeah.
So at that point, they're just so indebted to EA. It's like, all right, whatever you want us to do, I guess.
Yeah, it was a fucked up scenario. Like, it really bugs me that Visceral Games is no longer around, because that was such a talented studio. In the short time they were doing stuff, especially stuff that they wanted to do, they were putting out fucking great work. Like, not not even like mediocre work. Like there are some studios out there that put out decent games, but like if they were to go under, I wouldn't be like, oh man, that's like a real loss. When I heard Visceral closed, I was like, motherfuckers, are you kidding me? You closed them down after you forced them to do a fucking Battlefield game that nobody plays Battlefield to fucking play cops and robbers. That doesn't even make sense. And like you force them to do a game that they don't want to do. They still put out a good game because honestly, Battlefield Hardline's probably one of the best Battlefield games that's come out in the past fucking decade. And because it didn't sell enough, you fucking shutter the studio instead of, I don't know, just like giving them a project that they can actually do and that'll actually be good and make money. Like not every fucking studio has to make Battlefield. Sorry. Like it's super. It just pisses me off now.
It's annoying because it's clearly them seeing like Call of Duty being a yearly franchise type game, and they're like, oh, we got to do that with every single IP we have. We need to have an Assassin's Creed game every year, a Battlefield game every year. Oh, we don't have the people for it because we shut down all the developers we bought out. And that's the problem. They've done it so many times. One of my favorite studios, Pandemic, they made some of my favorite games. They're gone now because EA bought them and ran them into the ground.
Yeah.
And they do it all the time. I'm not up to date with their current processes, but I know in the past they've intentionally either filed completely frivolous lawsuits to like completely bankrupt smaller companies and then buy them for peanuts and then just run them into the ground just to get rid of competition. Or they do it to just hoard another developer.
Oh, yeah.
And it's ridiculous because you see so many good developers just get caught in that trap.
Yeah. They do it to acquire IPs too. So if like there's a studio that is putting out like IPs that they might want, they'll do the same thing just to get to the intellectual property so that they can make their games or like keep their games from having competition. And I totally forgot about Pandemic because I fucking love that studio too. They put out the Mercenary games, which are excellent. And I actually started playing the
They put out the original Battlefronts too.
Yeah, excellent studio. And I actually just started playing one of the last Visceral games that came out, which was Dante's Inferno. And even though people shit on that game, it's actually pretty fucking good. I'm enjoying it.
I like that game a lot. I haven't beaten it, but I was playing it, and then I started reading the Divine Comedy, and I'm like, they just straight up wholesale took some lines from the Divine Comedy. I'm like, that is mind blowing. It's like, because it's like this frat bro-ish version of it, but then you get some like, you get Virgil actually saying actual passages, and it's like, oh, hold up. It's a very strange diversion, but I like it. And Visceral was full of great ideas like that. If you can call that a great idea, I personally think it's genius.
I think that game just came out at the wrong time. That's all I think.
Oh, absolutely. Because everyone's like, oh, it's a God of War clone, which God of War wasn't the first hack and slash type game, you know?
No, yeah, it wasn't a God of War clone. It was just similar enough to it. That's all it was. All right, Dead Space. Now, let's get into the shit.
Dead Space.
Yeah. The first time I played this game, there were a few things that stood out to me besides the aesthetic and stuff. The first was I like the fucking controls. Like the original Dead Space's controls just did everything that Resident Evil 4 did it a little bit better, made it a little bit tighter. The setting of the game was something that I had never seen before. Nobody had done, like, you would figure that Alien had been around for so long, like that the space station thing would have been done very well, but it really never was. Dead Space did it excellent, and they actually made it so like they took that setting and cranked up the atmosphere so much that it was like you were there. It really sucked you in. And then the third thing that they did that fucking blew my mind, and still very few developers have been able to do to this day, they made combat interesting by changing the formula of shoot the fucking guy in the head. Instead of shooting in the head, you had to blow off the limbs. And that was like, it was such a weird way to take an action game and turn it on its head. Because now you're not like, you almost have to reprogram your brain to be like, okay, I'm not aiming for headshots anymore. I have to fucking like blow off legs and blow off arms. And they did the combat in such a way where there's so many enemies sometimes that you have to prioritize like limbs of enemies so that way you can either get them on the ground so they're not moving as fast or take out their arms so that they can't attack you. And it turned every combat scenario in the game into a mini puzzle. Like, this game doesn't have many puzzles, like actual puzzles, but it turned the combat into a puzzle, which I found fucking awesome. So what were some of the things when you played the game that you thought were like that? Those were the three that stood out instantly when I started playing.
Well, you mentioned the aesthetic, and that's one of the main things that grabbed me, because I agree. You see Alien, which, if there's anything that this game reminds you of, chances are it's a direct influence, because Alien was another one that they cited as a big influence. It's weird that someone hadn't tried to translate that into a video game, or done it well at least. And Dead Space just does everything so incredibly well. Everything it sets out to do is mind-blowing to me, because you see this game from so early on in the grand scheme of things that just accomplishes what other games nowadays struggle to achieve even a fraction of. And it's because they put in actual effort. And when I say that, I don't mean it to be cheeky. I mean it as a genuine praise. They're very talented and skilled individuals working on this, and clearly had a passion for it. So the aesthetics of it in general, and also just the sound design and the ability to communicate just so many different ways that you should be scared, but you need to keep going. Like, so much of the lighting and sound especially is so perfect. There have been so many times where I'm thrown off because I see a shadow that is almost exactly like an enemy shadow, but it's not. And I'm like, oh, is that intentional, or am I just scared? It's fantastic. And the sound especially, you hear things that sound like the very distinct noises that different enemies make, but it's not that. It's just some like rusty machinery. All of it just coalesces so perfectly into creating the absolute just horror setting. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I would have to agree that the sound design is another thing that really like took it to another level. Like, the amount of times where you'll be in a room and you'll hear a pipe fall, and then you'll turn around to look at like where that sound came from. Because first of all, the surround sound in this game is superb. If you're playing even with stereo headphones, you can kind of tell where almost anything is. But then they know, like, hey, we're gonna make this noise. It's gonna be like a pipe falling behind them. They're gonna think it's an enemy coming from a vent, so they'll turn around. And while they're turned around, we'll have an actual enemy sneak up behind them. And like, they had all these scenarios planned, and it never gets old. Like, you would think after like the 30th time this happens that, you'd be expecting it, but they do such a good job at using the sound to subvert your expectations and draw your attention elsewhere, and then like surprise you on the back end of that. And that it's just masterful level design and masterful like planning on the developer's part to kind of trick the player into going down the rabbit hole that they're kind of setting up for you, and then messing with you the entirety of the game, which is really fucking cool. And like, I don't remember, well, I can't think of any other games that do it as well as the original Dead Space does.
I'm trying to think of another horror game that I feel has done it as well, and I'm drawing a blank. Like, I'm not usually one to praise sound design specifically and single it out, but Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 just get it so perfectly right. It's almost like a game that trolls you, where it's like, oh, we're going to make a noise over here. Oh, you thought that was an enemy? Nah, dude, you're good. And then the second you're trying to like recover from that, where you're like, okay, it was fine, then it hits you. It's like a 1-2 punch of a game. And that happens so many times. You think you'd get used to it, but you really don't, because you always think the last time it happened is the last time it'll happen. And one of the biggest scenes in the game is there's a tentacle that just comes out of nowhere, and smacks you, completely changes up the game. And you're like, all right, I wasn't expecting that. That's completely changed my perception of things. Now I'm scared to even move. And once you're done with that scene, you're like, all right, I'm going to stay here for a moment because now I'm scared to do anything else. And then just as you're, getting back into the gameplay loop, it happens again. And you're like, all right, I'm just on edge the whole time now, I guess.
Yeah. And the game does an excellent job of keeping you that way almost the whole way through. And then in certain areas where you think enemies are going to be, there aren't any. Like it'll just keep you on your toes by literally not giving you the thing you expect, even though it's a game and shooting things is fun. It kind of draws out those areas where you're not seeing enemies just long enough so that way when an enemy shows up, it'll actually surprise you. Where other games have this issue where I think the developers think that if they're not throwing constant enemies at you, that you're going to get bored. And that's not always the case, This game has a great pace to it where it's you'll have long, probably 5-6 minute stretches where you won't see an enemy. Then all of a sudden out of the blue, when you're finally starting to be okay, cool, I can navigate this area, I can solve this puzzle and get back to what I need to do. Right when that happens, right when you get in that little I have room to breathe moment, then they hit you with enemies. They'll hit you with an ambush or something will go off and lock you in a room with 4 or 5 enemies and you're scared shitless. The pacing and the way they have done that in this game is, like I said, it's masterful. The developers, I don't know what they were thinking when they were putting this game together or what previous experience led to them being so good at setting up these moments. But no other game really does it as well as this one does. At least not until recently. The only other game I would say as of recently, the past, I'm saying decade, that's done it quite even close to this is probably Resident Evil 7. I wouldn't even say Resident Evil 8 because Resident Evil 8 bears a little bit more it on the action side, but Resident Evil 7 does it very well for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And Resident Evil 7, it was constantly subverting my expectations. I remember distinctly, to diverge a bit, when I played through it once on hard or normal, and I was like, oh, that was good. And I played it on Madhouse, the hardest difficulty, thinking all right, I know where everything's at now. This will be easy. Everything's changed. And there's a specific moment where a later stage enemy just comes out of nowhere. I screamed and had to pause the game. I was so thrown off. And Dead Space is full of moments like that. I've played it at least 4 times now. There's still moments where I'm expecting one thing and get hit by another thing. And I praise the sound design so much because it knows what sort of noises to make to get your attention. But then it also understands that sometimes the best thing you can do is not make any noise at all. There's a specific moment that is burned into my brain. It's in chapter 7, the one where you're in the mining section, where you're doing all of that, and you're 3/4 of the way through the level, and if you go up to a weapons bench, you're in this little area that feels like a safe area, where you just go up to it and you're all right, yeah, I'm gonna go up to this weapons bench. The second you do that, an enemy spawns in and you can see it right by you. It scared the shit out of me. I was oh my fucking god. I immediately backed out of the workbench to deal with that because I was he didn't make any noise. This has not happened a single time before now. And then I tested it. I'm is that guy always there? If I don't go to this workbench, is he gonna be there? Sure as shit, he only spawns in if you go to the workbench. He's specifically there to scare you. And this is later in the game. This is more than halfway through the game, and that's the first time they've done that specific scare. So they were sitting there thinking, oh, I got this idea. Now, if we do it at the start, you're going to blow your load too early. It won't be as impactful. But if you let people get into this mindset of all right, if there's a workbench here, chances are there's no enemies. I'll go into the workbench and fiddle around a bit. If you let them get accustomed to that sort of perceived safety and then take it away, then you get somewhere with it. You can't just do it immediately just because like, oh, it's going to be scary.
Yeah.
You have to build up to it.
Yeah. And they do an excellent job of it each time. Like there's a distinct moment that's actually, I'll put it up there with the Mr. X breaking through the walls in the original Resident Evil 2 game for scaring the shit out of me. And what's really impressive is it actually involves no sound. It's when you first go and do your like walk in not zero gravity, but like in the outer space portion of the station where there's no sound. So like if you're in an area with no air, there's usually no sound, or very limited sound, I should say. You can hear Isaac breathing, which is really cool. But there's a part where you're cutting through this outside section, and the first time you cut through there's nothing out there. You go through safely, and then you have to get an item and then come back through. On the way back, they actually have an enemy spawn outside, and it's funny because you've passed through that area the first time and there was nothing there, you don't expect there to be an enemy the second time through. And the second time through, like, there's no sound. All you hear is Isaac's breathing. So when you stop to take a look at something or open a door and you see something come up directly behind you, it scares the shit out of you. And what's crazy about it is that, like, it scared me so bad that I like flinched, but there was no sound involved. Like because it's outer space. Like all you could hear is Isaac's like heavy breath, and just seeing the enemy's arm come on my screen and then his body like just like almost take over Isaac's on my screen scared the crap out of me. It was so fucking good. But that goes down in like as one of the greatest scares I've ever had in a video game, just because like they didn't use the loud thumping music to get me. They didn't use like a loud noise combined with something like breaking through something to get me. They literally just used an enemy spawning behind me in a place that I didn't expect. Didn't involve sound or anything. That's fucking excellent game design.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another one. That's one of my favorite moments in any game, is that specific one. And it's because it betrays your trust, you know. You're already getting into the gameplay loop of like, you know, you have a hub area and you have to go out, do these objectives, come back to the hub area. You're already getting into that mindset like, all right, this is the gameplay, this is what I'm doing. And then the second you're getting comfy with it, it betrays your trust, and it's like, oh, you thought things would be the same? No. We're going to scare you. And it is so perfectly crafted of a scare, because you're right. They could have just done the lazy jump scare where it's a loud noise, something happens. But instead, they're people who understand horror, and they understand games. And they're like, all right, how can we utilize these two very distinct things to make something good? And it's like, well, my direct interaction of moving through this and thinking nothing's going to be different, thinking I can just run through this, is going to do me into the scare. And that it's just that level of insight into what is scary and how games get played that lends itself so perfectly to why Dead Space is not only a great game, but a great horror game.
And the other thing that I really want to talk about too, that's probably, I want to say this might be one of the first games that ever did it. And it still impresses me to this day, actually. It's the first game I ever played where there was no HUD at all on the screen, because they used the character's armor as your heads-up display, essentially. Your character, the back of your character, the back of Isaac's suit, displays how much health you have. It displays how much telekinesis you have. And when you raise your gun, there's an ammo counter on the gun itself, like a little kind of holographic ammo counter. And the first time I played it, I didn't realize that. Like I didn't. They did it in such a way where it was like I knew what those things were. I understood the purpose of them, but it didn't click in my head that like, hey, I don't have anything else on the screen telling me how much ammo I have left in my inventory, or how much life I have left on my character, or how much, like of my special ability I have left to use. Everything's right there in front of you the entire time, and it completely immerses you in the game because you're not constantly looking at different HUD elements all over. You're just looking at Isaac. All you really need to do is watch Isaac to see what's going on. You know what your status is. And what's really crazy about it, it's one of the things that like never annoyed me and still doesn't annoy me to this day, but the game never tells you how much ammo you have left, which actually makes it even more immersive and more scary. So you'll know how much ammo you have left in your gun, but you don't know how much ammo you have left in your inventory until you actually fucking open up your inventory, which again isn't really a screen. It more is like your character's heads up display that he's pulling up himself. So it immerses you even more because your inventory and pause screen isn't really a pause screen at all. The game's still going while you're looking at your shit. So you can't just like stop in the middle of a battle and be like, oh shit, I have to check how much ammo I have. That's not an option. The game's just going to keep going. The enemies are going to keep attacking. That was one of the most brilliant game design mechanics I have ever seen. And it's insane that to this day, more games don't use that, or more games don't try to implement something like that.
It's especially upsetting because it is just so perfect. It lends itself so wonderfully to the horror game genre, especially because you want all your information easily readable and readily available. Dead Space does that so perfectly. All the info you need is right where you're always going to be looking. It's right in the center. And it's immediately obvious what it does. You see this big bar on your back. Oh, what does that do? You get hit. It goes down. Oh, that's my health. All right. Understandable. You see a number on your gun. You can take a guess as to what that is. It goes down when you shoot. Oh, that's my ammo. Perfect. It's easily readable. There's no friction to that. And it's annoying because it's so well implemented. So much so that a later game that at least some of the Visceral devs worked on, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, did something similar where they had a very limited UI or HUD in that. They put all that information on a gun. So it's like, clearly this is something they appreciate, is non-invasive HUD elements, which you would think at this point in games we would be almost entirely adopting that, but still no. Which is fine, I guess, but in something like a horror game, you want it to be as the least intrusive elements possible in it. That's why walking simulators can get you so immersed, because there's nothing there to read.
Yeah. And the craziest thing is, and I didn't even think about it the other day until I was watching a YouTube video about like old school survival horror stuff. The only other games that really did that were the original Resident Evil games. Well, specifically Resident Evil 2 and beyond. Yes, you didn't know how much ammo you had. I would normally just count the ammo in my head when I would fire a gun. But the game told you how much life you had based on your character's animation. Like, if your character was limping, your character was like in like the warning zone, essentially. If your character was limping and hunched over and really slow, they were in danger. The game relayed that information to you without clogging up your screen. If you look at like old Resident Evil games, there's nothing on your screen to tell you what's going on. There's no HUD. It's just an image. It's like a still shot from a movie every single screen. And I'm really impressed that they were able to kind of take that idea and put it into Dead Space in such a way that it's like you would never think a modern game would be able to do that and do it effectively and give the player all the information they need without a HUD. Like, you would never think that like there was a way around it. And they had to have had that idea when designing Isaac's suit, That's the only way I can think of it. Is that like when they were in the early stages of the game putting that suit together, they were like, hey, what if instead of having all these elements on screen, we could just consolidate it to this area of the screen on the character, so that way there's nothing else like breaking the immersion of things. That's, again, I'm so mad that this developer's gone, because that's fucking genius thinking, and nobody is doing that anymore. That's not, like, I feel like every game that's coming out, there's nothing this creative in it. And it's frustrating because, again, this game is fucking 15 years old now. Like, if this game was a human, next year it could get its fucking learner's permit. And I feel like that idea has not been evolved at all in the past decade and a half. It's fucking crazy.
And that's what's upsetting, is one of the main driving forces in the development of Dead Space was, if you want to add an element to it, we need to innovate on it. Like, they talk at length about the melee, for instance, going back to citing Resident Evil 4 as a big influence on it, because that game blew up. It was what everything was taking influence from. They said that the melee was just so basic. You know, like, we got to have a melee, but we got to do it a little better. And it was thinking that for every element that makes a game great. You think, all right, the sound design in X is good. We can do it better. Oh, the melee is all right in that. We can do it better. And you do that so much that it's just, if you put in the effort and you put in the passion, it's going to be something you're actually proud of. And that's how you end up with something like Dead Space. And the same thing is echoed in Dead Space 2. Everything I can think to have a problem with in Dead Space 1, which isn't even a problem at that point, but things I would like expanded on, is expanded on in Dead Space 2. The combat feels better. The scares feel better. The actual, like, meleeing feels fantastic. And one of the main things is kinesis. You never use that as a combat option in Dead Space 1. It's there, but it doesn't do much. Dead Space 2, it immediately is telling you, hey, why don't you try this out again? I think you'll like it a little better. Immediately, it's better. And everything about it, even just the little animations, like when you bring up your inventory and you're looking through, you're cycling through, Isaac is actively moving his head in small increments. It would have been so easy to just, like, have the inventory brought up. He's just staring blankly at it. It took somebody being like, hey, if this is an actual screen in his view, shouldn't he be moving his head so it's readable to the audience? Like, oh, he's looking at this. He's actively engaged in this. Because that is, you know, player to character, like, cohesion. It's telling you without you even knowing, all right, I am this guy. He is me. We're in this now.
Yeah, it seems like they took out every barrier separating the player from the game, which is insane. Like, there's no HUD. Yeah, everything that you need is everything that the character has. It completely puts you in his shoes. And not any, like I said, no games coming out right now are doing it as well as this game did it. And you're absolutely right about Dead Space 2. Dead Space 2, with the telekinesis in particular, it took that ability to a whole nother level. Like, being able to, like, shoot the enemy limbs back at the enemy and have it cause, like, massive damage. That was a game changer. That made me play the game differently, and not in a bad way. Like, in Dead Space 1, the game never really limits how much ammo you have. Like, yeah, there is a capacity limit in your inventory, but in Dead Space 1, you're kind of hard pressed to run out of ammo. But I remember distinctly when I played Dead Space 2, it happened pretty fucking frequently. And having that telekinesis in your back pocket to kind of just, like, bust out and use as a defensive or an offensive tool was a really good, like, change in gameplay. I think Dead Space 2 actually did specifically the survival portion of the game a little bit better than Dead Space 1, because I can play through Dead Space 1 and never even, like, come close to running out of ammo. which meant every battle just was like, all the battles kind of played out the same in Dead Space 1 once you got to a certain point. Like about halfway through the game, when your rig's significantly upgraded and you have the inventory space to spare when it comes to like picking up ammo, the game becomes very, very easy. I mean, you can beat Dead Space 1 literally just using the plasma cutter. Like, that's it. Like, you can beat the whole game using it. It's actually an achievement in the 360 version, I want to say. But in Dead Space 2, they really start limiting the amount of ammo that's dropped, and the enemy count is increased in the game. So you're constantly running out of ammo. So that telekinesis ability is clutch in a lot of situations. When you'll walk into a room, realize you only have 3 shots left, but there's like 6 enemies. And then you can kind of game plan how you're going to take them out using their own body parts after you shoot them off. It's really fucking cool.
And that was one of the main things I noticed on my most recent playthrough of Dead Space 2. I started playing it after my 3rd or 4th playthrough of Dead Space 1. I was like, all right, I'm going to move on to 2 now. I'm going to replay it just because I love that game. I started playing Dead Space 2, and one of the first big combat arenas you get into, it's real early on. I'm like, all right, in Dead Space 1, it was kind of rudimentary. You could like back up into a corner and just shoot them and whatnot. I tried doing that in one room in Dead Space 2. The game knew I would do that. It was like I was cattle, and it was like pushing me to do that. They're like, yeah, go. Why don't you backtrack a little bit? Oh, we spawned the guy right there too. Oh, did you get scared? Yeah, you got scared. You shouldn't have done that. You should have just tried to fight it. And I was like, damn, sitting in the corner is not going to work. You need to actually be engaged. And that was another thing with Dead Space 2, you know. In Dead Space 1, on my first just like straight playthrough, I only used the line gun and plasma cutter, and probably could have done fine with one of the two. Like, I didn't bother with anything else. Dead Space 2, I found myself being a lot more like, oh man, what's going to be useful for this? All the guns are upgraded. They have more usability. If the guns weren't working out, the enemies will make it worth it. Like, there's one that's just like a sniper rifle or something. That's really useful circumstantially too. All sorts of different things. And the game isn't just dropping ammo for the guns you have, but the guns that you could be using too. So it's pushing you to experiment more. And then also, yeah, you still have the kinesis in your back pocket, and it's actually useful now too.
My first playthrough of the original Dead Space, I think I did with only 2 weapons. Like, the entirety of the game, I think, was the line gun and the pistol, just like you. And then the second playthrough, I did just the plasma cutter, and that was it. Dead Space 2, like, I distinctly remember. Like, it's been a long time since I played Dead Space 2, but I remember, like, needing at least 3 weapons at any given time for a lot of the battle scenarios that they put you in. So that's the other crazy thing. They saw what was wrong with their original game design of Dead Space 1. As great as it is, there are issues with that game. And in Dead Space 2, I feel like they saw what was wrong with Dead Space 1 and did a hell of a job correcting that, like course correcting all the things that they saw as issues and that they knew they could do better. And especially when, like you pointed out perfectly, the way ambushes work in Dead Space 2 are a lot more, like, I don't want to say scripted, but they kind of plan for what the player's going to do a bit more. Whereas in Dead Space 1, they pretty much just plan on where you're going to enter the room and where you have to go, and then just drop enemies between you and the exit. In Dead Space 2, they're way more about figuring out what the player's going to do when they encounter the enemies and try to circumvent making that battle easy by placing enemies in very strategic locations, or even more importantly, having different types of enemies in each battle, so that way your playstyle can't be the same in every single battle. They like force you to change up your playstyle from room to room, just by tweaking the enemies and where they're spawning.
And sometimes they change up how you should be playing in the middle of it, or at least the recommended idea, because for the first half of a room battle, it'd be like, all right, I can just sit here and shoot. But then you get into some of the other enemies that they're gonna push towards you, and they're gonna challenge what you're gonna do. And it's like, oh shit, if I just stand here, they're gonna get me. If I keep doing what I'm doing, I have to figure out something else now. And if you're playing that for the first time, you're gonna be all over the place trying to figure out what you should be doing. And that's where the like little bits of a puzzle in every room kind of come in, where it's like, all right, I have options. That's what makes it scary, is the options of what I can do. And I'm trying to figure that out. You're essentially building the track while you're riding the train, you know? You're going through, you're trying to figure out how to deal with this situation you're in. And then your course correction puts you in a different situation, so you're just constantly on edge. And then you get through it and you're like, all right, how much longer of this game? All right, I think I can do that.
They do an excellent job of setting scenarios up, for sure. Which brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. The game's difficulty as a whole. They do a really fucking good job of making different difficulty levels and really challenging the player as they go up. A lot of the times you get your basic, like, easy, normal, hard. And normally I would start a game on hard mode. In Dead Space 1, starting on hard is actually pretty difficult and pretty fucking challenging. They do a real good job of limiting ammo, making enemies hit harder, and the scenarios that you're caught in, it just gives it a real challenge. Dead Space 2, in particular, has some fucking insane difficulty modes, and they completely went out of their way to challenge the player as much as possible and really put shit to the test when it comes to people I thought they were fucking awesome at Dead Space 1. And I fucking love that. I love the fact that they were like, hey, you Dead Space 1 players think you're the shit because you beat the game on hard mode? Try this fucking shit. And they just added in I forgot what the name of the game mode where you can only save essentially 3 times throughout the game. It's like hardcore or something like that.
I think they just call it, I think it's just hardcore. Because there's Zealot and then hardcore.
Yeah, and hardcore is fucked up. Like, you really have to plan your shit out, and you can dump a lot of time into that. But again, it's them giving the players what they want, like what was missing in the first game. It's very rare that a developer's going like, how can we extend the life of this game as a whole? And Dead Space 2, yeah, it had multiplayer, but it also had like these different modes for single player, which made it really fucking fun, really interesting, and gave it a shit ton of replay value. So I totally commend Visceral for doing that as well. That's something that they didn't have to do, but I'm glad as hell that they did it.
And I'm a big fan of the Dead Space 1 gameplay loop, where it's just, the hub areas into objectives into the hub area. But Dead Space 2, if there's a big push for action to be more towards the forefront, obviously having a more linear sort of straightforwardness to it is pretty good too, because then it's also like you don't have as many like avenues for what you can do. And that's good in a sense, because it's like, I'm scared to go into the next room. That's where I need to go though. I'm scared of what's going to happen next. Like, there's no putting it off. But it makes the game feel a little less, it feels a little less full, which is probably the only gripe I have with Dead Space 2. I think, obviously, there's more of a push for an action-first mindset on it. But I feel like they reached a good balance where, the enemies are more tenacious. They want you to be dead. That is so apparent in every encounter, because they're just so ferocious with it that it evens out. There's more enemies, there's more action. It balances itself.
It does.
Dead Space 3, that's the problem. It's just the enemies are easy and it's too action-y. They didn't balance it at all, because then it just feels like a shooter at that point. I may as well be playing Uncharted or Call of Duty. Like, the combat is nothing at that point.
I feel like they understood like how to make a good single player experience scary, but doing that in co-op is a much harder like thing to do. And especially for a game that they weren't planning on making co-op to begin with, I understand why they kind of got put into a corner when it came to Dead Space 3. And Dead Space 2 also had the other issue where Dead Space 2 is on 2 discs. So the idea of backtracking would probably be more of an issue based on the literal like limitations of space that they had on the discs themselves. But with that being said, I personally think the pacing, as good as the pacing is in Dead Space 1, in the last probably, I'll say 3 chapters of that game, it starts to kind of taper down a little bit. Like I feel in the first like 8 or so chapters, it's kind of like a constant ramp up. And then once you get to like the final 3 chapters, you're kind of just like, I feel it, like the game feels like it's coming to an end, but not like a huge climactic ending. Not until you hit the very end of that final chapter. Whereas Dead Space 2's pace and the scenarios that they have you in, it's just like, it's balls to the wall, ramp up the entire way, go, go, go. And I feel like creating that more linear experience definitely helps that. Like, it helps that flow a little bit more. Because they don't have to worry about, like, is the player getting lost in this level? Is the player just exploring to see if they can find stuff? Because that kind of dulls the game out a little bit. Having less kind of to look around and just like wander kind of makes the game better overall, even though in most games that's not the case. With Dead Space in particular, it keeps the action high, it keeps the tension and the atmosphere going, and then at the end of the day, it provides a much more, I guess, like I don't want to say like curated experience, but that's what it is. Like, they knew what they wanted, what experiences they wanted the player to have, and without having them explore more, they were able to kind of get that experience with everyone. Like, it's literally funneling you from place to place, battle to battle, scenario to scenario. It's one of the reasons I like Dead Space 2 as much as I do, because the increase in action that game has, because there's a lot more action moments and a lot more variations in enemies and all that stuff, it still has that atmosphere. And since they were able to curate it to the player and really like have these really cool set pieces in each and every chapter, the game just feels more tight and like it knows what it wants to be a little bit more.
It's difficult because I love both Dead Space 1 and 2. Like, I think they're both fantastic games. And every time I think of, like, I like the hub areas of Dead Space 1, I wish they were in 2. But I do like that I don't have to backtrack through nothing a lot in Dead Space 2. And I appreciate that it's just, this is your objective, go to it. And there's no real opportunity to get lost, and there's still some exploration to do in Dead Space 2. But with Dead Space 1, it's just, I don't know. It does feel like it weighs on you after a bit, because every single level, it's segmented into levels, which is something I appreciated more in Dead Space 2 after playing Dead Space 1, is that Dead Space 2 is just like you're playing a movie. And usually that's for like exclusively for Kojima games where you're literally just watching a movie and occasionally you move. But in this, it's like, I'm the guy who's doing all the things. I am actually playing the movie. And it's just one seamless transition, which is what they always wanted to do in Dead Space, at least in the first one. But then it's still chopped up into actual levels, and it feels too gamified at that point. Dead Space 2 refined even that. They took even the slightest sharp edge and sanded it down a little bit to make it just completely so well polished that it's impossible to try and replicate that without having a previous subject to work with. And Dead Space 1 is incredibly important for that. Dead Space 2 just improved on that even more, which sometimes you see games do with their predecessors, but they don't do it nearly as well. And you're already starting from such a high place. How do you think you could even build higher? But Dead Space 2 just accomplishes that like it was nothing, which makes it's hard because it's like you're a parent and you have two great children. You have one child, you're my miracle child. I was never expecting to have you. And then you have his younger brother, and it's like, I love you so much. You are wonderful. And then you get the third one. I don't want to say child, but you get the third game, and it's like you want to love it because it's part of your family, but then it's like, you shit on the rug again. I guess I can love you.
Yeah, it's hard. Dead Space is kind of a hard series to love, only because of the end. Like, I love the first two games so much, and the third one I just will never play again because I have no desire to. With that being said, I still think Dead Space 1 and 2 are fucking absolute classics, and they will always be absolute classics, regardless of if this remake coming out is good or bad or whatnot. I'm sure it's going to be pretty good. I'm hoping it's on like the levels of like the RE2 remake and that stuff. But like the originals still hold up to this day. Like I'm at the very end of Dead Space 1 because I've been replaying Dead Space 1 since I knew we were going to talk about it. I think I'm on chapter 11 right now. So I'm on the chapter before the final chapter. And the game holds up well. There's shit that doesn't look great. Like the shadows in the game at the time looked awesome. Now, not so much because they're very fucking blocky. Like that's something that I'm sure they have improved upon the remake. Like I've seen the preview videos of it, and it's like stuff like that. Yeah, it didn't hold up well, but the game plays great still. Like if you were to boot up Dead Space 1 or Dead Space 2 right now, you would be hard pressed to find a game that plays as well as either of those two games do, because they're near perfection when it comes to survival horror. In atmosphere, and they're just great. Like you can almost disregard the age of the graphics because the art style of the game is nearly timeless. Outside of the weird fucking like human character models, everything else looks really good. As long as you don't get too close to the necromorphs or the human character models, everything looks fucking great. And even the necromorphs kind of hold up well in motion. They're just like, if you shoot a necromorph and then look at its body, it's not the most detailed thing in the world, but like it gets the job done. You get what they were going for. You get the gist.
That's one of the big things that, that could be improved on is the graphics and whatnot, obviously. And that's just a product of the time. One of the big things I noticed that I can't unsee is whenever you're dealing with they call them the drag tentacles because it's a tentacle that drags you around. Once you destroy it, it just kind of like actually fades out. And that's just...
Yeah, I noticed that today.
there's nothing you can really do about that. So improving on things like that is only going to add to the game. Like it's only going to add to the immersion. But that being said, the game still looks and plays amazingly well. And I think oftentimes people forget like a game like Resident Evil 4, that was originally for the GameCube. It was on PlayStation 2. And that game looks amazing. Games are... I think they've reached their peak. I think we can stop trying to make it look realistic. We can go back to making it a little stylized. However, Dead Space is one of those games where it's a happy medium where artists can actually do realistic, but also make it a little stylized, Why not have something be a little more shadowy? It's going to make it even better. Go for it. Who cares? That was one of the things that really translated well in the actual gameplay for Dead Space 1. You look at the concept art, and then you look at the actual areas that it's art for. You're like, Jesus, they really knew what they were doing with this. This feels like a lived-in space. And for the time, that is incredible, even for now. Because you see these AAA games that can't capture that feeling. They can't capture the feeling of like, you look at a wall in this spaceship, this decrepit old spaceship that's just for like mining and planet cracking, things like that. You don't feel, in other games, it doesn't feel lived in. But you see it in Dead Space, you're like, yeah, somebody was actually here.
They did what I call handcrafted like work. Like you can tell somebody went in, put the time and energy into every single area of the game and made sure that not only did it look lived in, not only did it look good, the lighting looked good, but that it actually like represented what the feel of the game was in such a way that you couldn't mistake it for another game. Like you can look at Dead Space. If you were to see a screenshot of Dead Space right now, you wouldn't be able to say it looks like another game. The closest you would probably like say it resembles, and as like when I got to chapter 10 in Dead Space today, I thought about it, is a Doom 3. But the art style to Doom 3 is so different that if you were to put these games side by side, even though they both take place on space stations, even though they're from around the same time, you can definitely tell which game is which just based on the way like the rooms look, the way the pipes are laid out in the space station. Like everything is very unique in both games, but the art style is just different enough where you'd be able to tell the difference between the two.
And that's something Dead Space 1 does incredibly well. Like Doom 3, I have no idea how close to the end of the game I was when I played that. I played it for like 10 hours and I was like, it's still going? And that game prides itself on having great shadows and whatnot. But they sacrifice so much in just like the readability of the rooms you're in. Everything looks the same. Granted, who am I to say that a space station wouldn't look all the same? I've never been on one. But Dead Space, you're on a ship. It is a contained space. It has need for everything that modern society needs. It needs an engine room. It needs a medical area. It needs a cafeteria. They could have very easily just made all of those look identical and been like, yeah, that's your lot. Instead, they were like, no, we need to make this readable. People need to know where they are. Even if it doesn't matter at all, it matters.
Yep. Even the places with the plants and stuff, right? Like, God, why can't I think of the name of it? But in the ship where they farm, wherever they're like farming the plants for oxygen, like there's like a whole area of the ship that you have to go to with that, which is fucking amazing. But like you said, each place is unique. Each place has a purpose. And I can honestly say in Doom 3, that is not the case. You're going from lab to lab to lab until you end up in hell. Whereas Dead Space, it's like, you know what part of the ship you're on. Like you can give me a screenshot of any level of the game and I can tell you like where that level is, where it takes place on the ship, like what it's used for. Like that's a lot of time and energy and thought going into that.
Absolutely. And in the loading screens between stations or between parts of the ship, you take like a little tram. And even that is just background storytelling. It's like, oh, this is a big ship. How big is it? It has its own dedicated tram system. That's how big it is. And that gives you an idea for the scale of this. And then just when things, it's so good at understanding when things might be getting a little boring to you because then it switches it. And it's fantastic. You think anytime you're making progress, it's undone. At one point, you send out like a distress beacon, you overcome some insurmountable challenge, and then you see one of the only other human characters, and they're like, "All right, yeah, it's a military ship." And they come over. Spoilers: they crash into your ship. Now you're going on to their ship. It's completely different from yours because it's outfitted to be like a military, like militia type thing. They aren't going to need all the storage that a mineral processing ship is going to need. It's more keyed towards military based things. And that insight towards what is actually readable to a person is fantastic and is lacking in so many different games. I'm specifically thinking of the game Fear, which
oh god,
a lot of people like. It was just so boring to me because of that. Like you can have some of the best gameplay on the planet. It's not going to do a whole lot for me if I'm going through the same exact corridor every single time. Dead Space understands that and keeps it both like gameplay wise engaging, but also visually engaging.
Yeah, I can attest to Fear because that game. Oh my god, the the office spaces in there. Every office looks exactly the same. All the hallways look exactly the same. Half the time you get lost in an area because the way you came in looks identical to the way you're supposed to exit. It's just there's no readability to the levels. Like as great as the gunplay is in that game, as great as the storyline is in Fear, and it got a candle to fucking what Dead Space is doing. It's so hard to get lost in Dead Space. And even if you do get lost in Dead Space, there's a fucking button that literally points you exactly where you need to go. It's like the idiot button. It's just like, oh, I'm lost. Where do I go? Click. Oh, point me that direction. Guess I go that way. Makes it super easy. They really did think of everything in Dead Space as far as like making it easy for the player to know where the hell they're going and what the hell is going on. I don't think any game around that time did as much as this game did for helping a player get from point A to point B without getting in their way or giving you a map that's literally got like an arrow for where you should go.
And that's the thing with Dead Space 1. Like, they have a map. It's not very good, but it's about as good as it could have been. So much so, I noticed in Dead Space 2, they just don't have the map anymore. Because they were like, all right, we can't fix a 3D map. A 3D map is always going to be a bad idea. I'm trying to think of other times it's been done. I remember I think it's Resident Evil Revelations, but it was so bad in that too. If it wasn't that.
The only good 3D map is Doom. Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the only good 3D maps I've ever used. But outside of that, you're right. There are no good 3D maps.
Come to think of it, I don't even know if it was in Revelations. I might have been thinking of Doom 2016 and Eternal. But regardless, Dead Space 2 was like, all right, we can't fix that map. We're just done with it. So what we're going to do, it works itself into the more linear gameplay routing of just pretty much a straight line. You can kind of go off, but the side paths are always going to lead you back to the main one. But also, in the little like idiot button to show you your objective, you can also cycle through and it shows you like, all right, here's the nearest store, here's the nearest save point, here's the nearest workbench. You can cycle through all of that. So you're always going to have the option of figuring out, all right, here's this. You don't have to look at a map anymore because you're always just going to be going through.
It's at this point in the podcast where Harrison's mic had issues and we had to kind of troubleshoot for a little bit and then hop back in, and we didn't know where we were. So if this spot seems a little bit weird, that's why. Thanks, and back to the podcast. Well, we're back. There were a little bit of technical difficulties, but
my fucking laptop decided 10% or 20% means it's dead.
Yeah.
Hey, asshole, half dead means half alive, too. I really need this laptop to continue loving me because I'm not buying another one.
Fair enough.
There's already a burn in my screen that is getting larger every time I turn on my laptop. And it's kind of like when you hear your grandpa cough a little harder each time. You're like, nah, grandpa's going to live forever. Yeah.
Well, you can keep hoping grandpa's going to live forever. Cross your fingers, folks. All right. So before the laptop goes down again, we're gonna touch on the last two things I want to touch on Dead Space. The story, which is number one. And then the second thing is going to be the things I dislike about the game, which there is a very fucking short list. But first I want to do the story, because I think the story is probably one of the strongest points that this game has. Because one, it's actually told entirely through the player's perspective. So Isaac sees everything, and it's very much like almost like a Half-Life if Half-Life was in third person. That's how I imagine the story is being told, which is really cool. But not only that, this game...
Funny enough, they cite Half-Life 2 as an influence as well, specifically because of Gordon, how story is told in that. It's all connected.
Go fucking figure. So I actually really like that. But on top of that, the twist at the end is probably one of my all-time favorite twists in a video game, which is funny because my other one is BioShock, and that one came out a year before.
We should say, go play this game. If you like horror, if you like video games, or if you just like anything, go play it,
It's good.
If you like if you like Bejeweled, you should play this game. Then you can be like, I like Bejeweled and Dead Space. That's who I am as a person.
Yeah, I think we've been gushing over this game for quite a while. So if they haven't played it, go play it, because spoilers are coming up right fucking now. So you've played this game through far more times than I have recently, since this is the playthrough I'm having right now is the first time in probably like a decade that I'm playing Dead Space again. So can you go through kind of like a quick synopsis of the story? Because it's not very complicated, but it does deliver like a really cool like twist at the end.
No, that's what surprises me with you saying you like the story, because I'm thinking like, is a story?
There is.
It's just the gameplay is just so tight that it's all I can focus on. And like when characters are talking at this point, obviously first time through I'm paying attention, but the second, third, fourth time through I'm like, whatever. Main plot of it is you're an engineer named Isaac Clarke, assumedly named after Isaac Asimov and fucking Lewis C. Clark, I don't remember. But space people, science people. He's an engineer. He's not a combat guy. And you go with this group of people to go check out this spaceship. This is kind of like your drunk uncle telling you the plot of something. I'm not drunk though. I might be your uncle, but regardless, you go with this group of people, and slowly but surely they start getting picked off one by one. And shit just gets fucked up. And they're telling you to do stuff the whole time, but it's weird. It never feels like you're the only one doing anything. Because it feels like the other people that are still alive are also working towards something. They aren't just like, you go do this, I'm going to take a little nap. No, it feels like they are also doing things in the background. Like they're having an equally exciting experience. At one point, you're the one. And you see this guy who's been with you the whole time. He's like, he looks absolutely awful, like he's been through some shit. And then he disappears after you do your bullshit. And then the next time you see him, he looks even worse, but he's still trying. And then he just gets completely smoked. And then it's like, oh, well, I guess that's how his story ends.
Pretty much.
And that's just a thing that happens. It's a lot of it is... I guess the actual plot of it is you're going to investigate the spaceship for some reason. Like something's going on. It's part of this big company that mines minerals and cracks planets to get the minerals and whatnot from the planets. And they discovered something. They went ghost. You gotta figure out why. You took the mission because your girlfriend is on that ship and you're like, oh shit, I gotta go check this out. I gotta see what's up. And then, you're going through it. Things develop as they do. And then when you get to the end, everything kind of just coalesces all into one thing. Eventually you see that there's these aliens, but they're kind of a mix of aliens and body horror meeting. So it's humans and aliens. Doesn't matter how they got there. All that matters is they're in between you and the end of the game. It's a pretty 1-to-1 ratio, Why don't you cut them out of the equation? And then also the umbrella of it is like your girlfriend's trapped in this. You gotta rescue her. So you're just going through all of that, trying to get to the end. Throughout it, it's just like you you and the group of people you're with have a very loose idea of what you have to do. And they're just trying to keep going and going and going. Like, they're living for the minute, not even the moment, but the absolute second to second they're trying to achieve. At one point, you get this distress beacon. You're like, all right, what do we do? Well, there's a giant monster on the outside of it. We can't do anything until we get rid of that. All right, let's do that. All right, now that we got that done, we can put the beacon on there. Okay, sweet. All right, we got that done. Oh, it's not strong enough. Okay, we got to make it stronger then. And it just keeps escalating from there. Eventually, you start to make some progress. And then, I guess spoilers, one of the people you're with the whole time, she was working for like Umbrella, but in Dead Space terms. Like Umbrella from Resident Evil, but for Dead Space. I don't know who. Doesn't matter. She ends up getting smoked by a giant alien, but not before she tells you that this giant obelisk that made everyone go crazy or whatever is not only a replica of an alien one that the ship originally found, but it's also making you crazy. The entire time your girlfriend's been dead. And that is like the most mind-blowing thing. So much so that Isaac is just destroyed by it. He doesn't even know what to do afterwards. I think that might sum it up. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that
kind of all over the place.
That's pretty much it. I mean, it's a pretty basic premise. Like, guy is kind of worried about his girlfriend, gets on this mission to go and see if she's okay, because she's on this planet cracker. And the entire time, keep in mind, like, your girlfriend's talking to you as you're playing. Like, as you're going through this game, she's telling you like how she misses you and the things that you need to do. They're mostly like calm communications, but there are one or two spots in the game where you actually like physically see her. So when it gets to the end of the game and you find out that your character has gone a little bit nutty and has been hallucinating the entire time, all the visions of his girlfriend, it kind of blows your mind, because you're like, but I've seen her, I've been talking to her, like she was there, and it throws you for a little bit of a loop. It's probably one of the better twists in a game ever, because the game does lead you to think that this person is real. I think the only downside to the storytelling is most of the plot's essentially broken up into one, you want to figure out what's going on and get off the USS Ishimura, which is the planet cracker that you're on. But it almost becomes a secondary objective to figure out where, I think her name's Nicole, where like your girlfriend Nicole is. And that's kind of where the plot, I don't want to say goes wrong, but it kind of loses its luster a little bit. I feel like if they emphasized the plot with Nicole more, then it would have been a much more relevant twist when it came up. Like, it would have hit a little bit harder. But 90% of the time you're going through the game, you're just like, get me off this fucking ship. I don't want to die. But yeah, overall, like, the story isn't told exceptionally well, but it's told well enough. Like, you're not going to get to the end of the game and be like, well, that was stupid. But I definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, no, that's the thing, because you're so caught up in like the moment to moment, like, all right, well, that ship blew up, now we need a different thing. All right, well, what's the different thing? You kind of forget that, oh, right, we're here for my girlfriend? Oh, I thought we just put ourselves in this situation just to try and get out of it, like a survival challenge.
Yeah.
Like, no, we were here for a purpose. I forget what that purpose is now, because clearly this shit is too fucked for any of us to handle. We just need to cut our losses and get out of here.
Yeah.
You get so caught up in that mindset, the proper one, that you forget that you're supposed to be caring about the other one, which that's something Dead Space 2 immediately fixes, where it's like, the game starts with Isaac being like, my girlfriend's dead. She's not real. These are hallucinations. And once that game starts, it does not stop. Like the ending throughout all of Dead Space 2, you're just going through like Isaac immediately recognizes like this shit is happening again. He's on some like space city now from the start, I think.
Yeah. I remember like a food court type thing.
But he's just like yeah. I remember seeing a skyline at one point.
Yeah.
I need to play that again. But he's going through that and he's like, all right, well, now I got to find out why this is happening. He finds out why it's happening because there's like a church dedicated to the worship of what are known as markers, which is what causes the main enemies, necromorphs. It's a fun little name to occur. So it's like you get some understanding of the world, but not enough to drown in it, which is it's a fine line, but Dead Space does it right.
Yeah. I think Dead Space 2 has a better storyline because your objective is very straightforward. Whereas in Dead Space 1, it's kind of muddled. There's a lot of MacGuffins that you have to go get or fix or do. Like, there's always something else that pops up. Dead Space 2 is a lot more streamlined. It's definitely an easier story to follow overall.
I'm almost wondering, like, Isaac specifically, he's an engineer on the team. The team is comprised of 3, like, security dudes. I don't remember what the girl is there for. I think she's, like, knowledgeable on the ship. And then Isaac is just an engineer. He's not there for combat-oriented things. He just, fate befalls him, so he needs to do that.
Yeah.
So I really don't understand why, thinking on it now, why they didn't just, like, he doesn't need a personal reason to be there. He's there because he's an engineer. Why wouldn't a team have him? But I guess it's to have, like, personal agency, like, this is your character, he needs a motivation now. But it's like, you could have just done away with the Nicole plot. But then again, there's nothing at the end tying it together, so I get it. But again, any issue you have with Dead Space 1, chances are Dead Space 2 fixes. Unless you were like, man, I really wish Dead Space had multiplayer. Then in which case, like, I guess it fixed that. I don't know.
Honestly, like, I'm looking at my list of quote-unquote cons for Dead Space, and the only things I can really complain about are that the weapons take up space in your inventory, which kind of drives me nuts because I always hate when weapons take up space in inventory. But it kind of almost discourages you from getting multiple weapons if you're, especially early on in the game, because you're like, okay, if you get another weapon, not only is it going to take up another spot in your inventory, but you also have to plan for the ammo taking up another spot in your inventory. And 90% of the time, especially if you're starting the game like I did and you upgraded the shit out of the plasma cutter as soon as possible, the secondary weapon that you pick up that's going to take up more space and that's going to need more space for ammo isn't going to be doing as much damage as the plasma cutter. So there's kind of this thing where it's like, why even bother carrying a second weapon? You might as well just fucking like stick with like 1 or 2 weapons at most and go with that. So it kind of discourages experimentation overall when it comes to like what you're using for weapons. And the second thing, which is probably the most annoying fucking thing that is in this game that I can complain about, is it does not let you combine shit in your inventory. So if you have a fucking small med pack, guess what? You can't combine 2 small med packs into a medium one, even though a fucking medium-sized med pack just looks like 2 small med packs put together. I don't know why it pisses me off so much, but it really pisses me off that they don't let you do that. I end up just selling my small med packs 90% of the time. But honestly,
I never thought of that, but I did make the connection, like, looking at a medium med pack, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, it's a bigger med pack. Then you get to the large one, it's like, oh, dude, that's just a value pack of small ones. Like, you're trying to cheat me out of this, essentially.
Yeah, it just looks like the 3 small med packs taped together. That's all it is.
Who knows? Maybe that'll be something they change. But also, I get it from a gameplay. Well, actually, no, because then if you're, I don't know. It hasn't ever been a thing I thought of, so I don't know how to feel on it. I don't hate it because, like, I never use the large med packs, and I seldom use the medium ones because, like, I'm the type of person in a survival horror game where if I have the ability to reload a section, and I get hit in that section, I'm like, I could have done that better. I'll reload. And then it's just me at that point. If I don't enjoy a game, if I'm doing that and don't enjoy it, then it's on me.
Yeah.
Where I want to do it perfectly, you know? And then I just end up in situations where it's like, all right, well, I probably could have just, you know, not done that and enjoyed the game, but instead I had to be perfect with it. Dead Space 2, it is difficult. It is more difficult to be safe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so in that, you just have to accept, like, you're going to get hit. You're going to fail a few times.
Yeah, that game is... I distinctly remember, like, a few combat scenarios where I must have retried it, like, 7 or 8 times just to get through it. Not even to get through it well. Like, just to get through it. And that almost never happened in Dead Space 1.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's a good ramp up of action. Where it's like Dead Space 1, you can get through a lot of those areas barely trying, we'll say.
Yeah.
But in Dead Space 2, it's like, man, you guys are putting in work today. And you just have to accept that. Like, unless you are planning to play real sweaty, just take the hit and move on, you know?
Yeah. So that's all I have for negatives of the game. Do you have anything that you can think of that, like, annoyed you or that you didn't like?
I will say I do appreciate in-game cutscenes where it's like, you know, control isn't entirely taken away, but that's kind of the problem where if you're watching an actual cutscene and you've played through the game before and you're like, I just want to get back to the gameplay, skip, okay, back to the game. In Dead Space 1, it's just, you're just sitting there, you're kind of futzing around with something like while some big event is going on, but it's nothing you can react to physically. It's just something for you to watch. At that point, I get bored and I'm like, I want to speed through this. I want to go fast. I've played this before. That kind of annoys me. But also, given the two options, I would rather have a game that just you can play through all at once. It's just you're always in control. Even if it lends itself to having some moments where you know exactly what's happening already because you played it.
I think there's a good balance in a game like God of War, where God of War, there's no camera cutaways and you're with him the entire time, but there are cutscenes, and there are cutscenes that you can skip if you want to. That's probably the best balance that I've seen. There are spots in Dead Space, like I was playing through one of the levels today where they literally like have you looking at a character through the glass, and then they lock the doors. So you just stand there just like watching this guy talk for like 5 minutes, and that shit is annoying.
I was about to say, I know the part you're talking about, and then I remembered there's multiple parts like that.
Oh yeah, it's like 4 of them.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There's one in the cafeteria where there's stuff to slow you down on the ground. It's like goop.
Yep.
And you're just seeing this man. He's just talking. I don't remember what happens to this man, but he annoys me a lot. If I see him in real life, it's on site. Like, I don't like him, this video game man. Specifically because even on the first playthrough, I'm like, this guy is just rambling on. He doesn't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And I guess it would be different if that was combat while he's talking, but then it's just, then you're not going to understand what he's saying. Then you're going to be distracted. Then you'll be like, wait, what did he say? Was that important? Fuck, I don't know. I was busy with this. So it's tough to be engaged, especially on a second or third playthrough with that. And there's no way to expedite that process.
Nope. It's like you have to just trudge through that stupid mud or fucking goo or whatever the hell it is and just deal with it.
But I feel like, at least in the bit I've replayed of Dead Space 2, I feel like those moments are much less so now. Like, I feel like they got a good understanding of the pacing of it. Because in those moments in Dead Space 1, it feels like it comes to a screeching halt, and sometimes it feels like it recognizes that, where it's like, oh, you were lulled into a sense of security where we've been talking for a minute. Oh, now there's an enemy. Now you have to run. Oh, you're trying to kill him? He can't die. It's like, oh, well, I guess that's a way to get me back into the gameplay. But that's one of the things that irked me. And then a very specific moment is just the last chapter felt incredibly, not incredibly rushed, but it just felt weird because it's almost entirely combat arenas. And that's not terrible, but you can really finish it up pretty quickly. Like there's none of the usual gameplay loop of like hub area into side objectives. It's a lot like Dead Space 2, which if you had the ability to play through these games all in one long session, that would probably lend itself really well to that. And it makes me wonder if they had intentions for a more linear focused for a sequel. Because the last chapter of Dead Space 1 plays out like Dead Space 2 does in its entirety.
Yeah, I think that's mostly because they're trying to, like, I think they're trying to go for, like, that big finale scene. And there's no real way to do that with the urgency that they were looking for with having, like, a hub area. Which is good game design because, like, it keeps the action going through the entirety of that last chapter. Like, it's just constantly go, rush to the end, which is awesome. But it does kind of, like, mess with the overall pacing of the game because you've grown so used to, no matter what's going on, you have this hub area to go back to. And these slower moments, whereas that last chapter is literally like, it's like the last chapter of Halo. Like, it's just fucking go. Balls to the wall, get through it, like big finale, big boom, shit exploding, like that kind of vibe, I guess.
I think that's probably the appropriate way to end a Dead Space game because, like, you're right. How else are you supposed to convey, like, this is the end of this journey, you know?
Yeah.
And, like, who says it can't end with a giant space monster? That's probably how it would end. I'm not an astronaut. I don't know what they deal with on a day-to-day basis. But that's probably what would happen. So it's like, it makes sense. And also, what else is Isaac supposed to do, you know? Just keep moving forward. That's what you've been doing the last, like, 10 hours. Just, what are we doing next? No. We're focusing on what we're doing now. And what we're doing now is running through this area. Somebody told me to bring this marker to this spot. I don't have a better idea. Guess I'll do that. And then it kind of works out, you know? And the game ends with a giant asteroid or whatever falling onto the planet where the marker's at, and it's just blows up. And then you get a little jump scare at the end.
Which I appreciate.
It was good. It got me. It got me. I don't know where else to put this, but a fun little Easter egg in it is there's 12 chapters, I think. Yeah, 12 chapters. The first letter of each chapter has a title. The first letter of each one spells out Nicole is dead, which, like, it's only something you kind of notice if you're looking at it. And you see it in a list, and it's like, hey, wait a minute. So, like, if you're paying attention, you can notice it, but it's also not something you're gonna be paying attention to.
I'm now intrigued. I'm actually looking that up.
So, I don't remember where I first learned that, but
oh wow,
it's a fun thing.
Yeah, you aren't kidding.
Yeah,
it actually does spell that out. That's fucking hilarious.
And also, the last chapter of the game is called Dead Space. I don't know where else to throw praise for that, but I liked that. I clapped when I saw it. It was great.
That's amazing.
I
never knew that.
I don't know. I don't have much bad to say about Dead Space. I just really enjoy it. I think it's a great game. I'm very excited to play more of it in any capacity.
I'm definitely excited for it.
I think they had a weird mobile game as well at some point. I feel like I'm recovering that.
Extraction. I think that's what it's called. I want to say is Dead Space Extraction. But it was essentially like a puzzle game, I think.
Oh yeah, that was for like the DS or something, right? Oh, I guess it's on Xbox too. Yeah, it's like a comic book.
Yeah, they had a lot of different properties because they were trying to make it a whole Dead Space universe. What? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not Extraction. It might be something else.
There is a Dead Space Extraction. I just don't know.
Now I'm going.
That's kind of the difficult thing. Like, Dead Space 1 doesn't lead into a sequel at all.
No.
And the director for the game cited some international films that end with like ambiguous endings or like really depressing endings. And to me that means like the game could have just ended at the first one. It really doesn't lead into a sequel at all. And Dead Space 2 starts with like a pretty fair beginning. Like, what would happen to Isaac? Well, he's crazy now. Okay. So where is he? He's in an asylum. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Perfect. Dead Space 3 makes no earthly sense to me because Isaac is just in an apartment. So that just really means like they weren't intending to get this far. They were probably like, yeah, we'll probably make another Dead Space after 1, but we don't know when. And then Dead Space 3 is like, yeah, Dead Space 2 made money, so make us a third one. So they really kind of didn't seem like they had any idea what to do afterwards.
Which is fine. Honestly, if there was only Dead Space 1, I would be happy. If there was Dead Space 1 and 2, I'd be even more happy because I love Dead Space 2.
Absolutely.
It's that third game that fucking ruins everything. The third game just shouldn't exist, and I think this series would be better off without it, which is why I'm hoping if they are doing the remake that they either reboot it from the remake or remake Dead Space 2 and then pretend Dead Space 3 didn't happen. And that those are probably the best options in my opinion.
That's what I guess not worries me, but it is something that I pay mind to is like, who's to say they even do anything after remaking Dead Space 1? Because with things like Fable Anniversary, they just did that. They haven't done Fable 2 or 3 or anything like that. They probably never will. But like games like that, where it's just you kind of remaster one and then you're like, all right, why would we do the other ones? The first one's the biggest one. So that's what makes me wonder, but I have a feeling it's going to do great sales. Like it's a game that is revered by, critics and fans alike. Like, it's just a lovely game, which sounds silly when it's a super gory space adventure game, but like it's a lovely thing.
I agree with you. It is a lovely game, and I think probably this is a good spot to end the podcast. I think we've touched on everything there is to talk about Dead Space, and even some of Dead Space 2 and Dead Space 3. So what do you say?
I think so. Yeah, because I was just about to get into random things I like. Like, I'm staring at the cover for Dead Space 2 thinking, yeah, it's cool watching the helmet go on. Like, I think if we're at that point, I think we can kind of like, simmer down and stop.
Yeah, put a little bit of a kebab in it. And with that,
I think so.
With that being said, it is great having you on. You've actually probably been mentioned in at least 2 or 3 of the podcasts before this one.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I've cited you as essentially the co-creator, so there you go.
The power has gone to my head immediately.
But I am glad we finally got to do this because this has been like months coming. And I hope we get to do it again soon because this was super fun. But is there anything...
I am absolutely down.
Is there anything you want to say to the handful of people that listen to this thing currently before we say our goodbyes?
I've been lying. I don't like Dead Space at all. I think it's think it's pretentious. Yeah, we'll go with that. It's pretentious somehow. No, Dead Space 1 is a great game. Play Dead Space 2. Give Dead Space 3 a try too if you feel like it's a fun enough game. One good thing I'll say about Dead Space 3, the little robots are kind of cute. I like the little robots.
They are pretty adorable.
That's about it. In comparison to the other two games, though, it has nothing on them. Go play Dead Space 1 and have some fun with it. That's about all I got.
Yeah, I agree with that. The robots in Dead Space 3 are pretty adorable. And they bring back ammo for you, which is pretty fucking sweet, too.
They're pretty good.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's going to be it for this episode of the podcast. Make sure you follow on the podcast service of your choosing. If you want, check out the YouTube video for this whenever I get around to editing it, which will probably be a week or so after this goes up. So
check us out on blip.tv. Is that still a thing?
I don't think it is.
I don't think it is. All right, don't look Blip TV up then.
All right, and that is it. Have a great day, folks, and I hope to see you next week. Have a good one. Peace.
Goodbye.